At some point last year, I made a decision that felt small at the time. I changed my nails. Shorter, less colour. My nail tech was confused. But it was a deliberate shift away from the bold, expressive aesthetic I had worn for years towards something quieter, more considered. And then I kept going. I cut my hair shorter, I styled it with more intention, I started wearing considerably less jewellery, I moved away from clothing that announced itself towards pieces that were tailored and quietly authoritative. Now, from the outside, most people would not have pointed to a single moment and said, something's different. But the changes have added up to something I found genuinely difficult to put into words until recently. I wanted to be wearing my look, not my look wearing me. Welcome to Recognised. I'm Merisha Stevenson, BBC broadcaster, executive facilitator and authority positioning strategist. This is the audio companion to my Substack where I write about credibility, visibility and what it actually takes to be recognised as the authority you already are. Today I wanted to talk about something that most professionals have never seriously examined. What your visuals are saying before you speak. For most of my professional life, when I've been in a room during a panel or a keynote, I've been the one running it. The host, the facilitator, the moderator, reading the room in a very particular way, watching for comprehension, managing the energy, holding the shape of the conversation. That is a specific kind of attention, skilled, but not the same as being in the audience. This year, I have had the less familiar experience of sitting on the other side, attending events as a participant rather than the person responsible for them. And what struck me almost immediately was how different that vantage point feels. Without the responsibility of facilitation, I found myself absorbing something I do not usually get to absorb. Not just what was being said, but how the room was really feeling and receiving it. The way people leaned in or leaned back, the moment attention sharpened or drifted, the shift that happened when an audience decides before a speaker has finished their opening sentence how seriously to take what comes next. And what I kept noticing was this. The content was rarely the deciding factor in that first moment. Something else was being assessed. Something faster, more instinctive, and considerably more consequential than most professionals have ever been taught to think about. In 1967, psychologist Albert Mehrabian published research on how people interpret communication, particularly in moments where what someone says and how they say it appears to contradict each other. His findings produced what became known as the 7-38-55 rule, that in those moments of ambiguity, people rely on words for just 7% of their interpretation, tone of voice for 38% and the visual cues for 55%. Mehrabian himself has clarified repeatedly that these numbers were never intended to apply to all communication in all contexts. The 93% figure has been widely repeated and just as widely misapplied. But here is what does remain true. When people are forming an impression of you, particularly in those moments before trust has been established, they're reading far more than your words. They're reading your presence, your bearing, your visual coherence. They are asking themselves, largely without realising it, whether everything they can see is consistent with everything they are about to hear. And that question gets answered before you have said a single thing. Across the events I've attended this year, a pattern repeated itself often enough that I stopped being surprised by it. There were speakers whose authority arrived before they spoke. Something about their overall presentation communicated, I belong here, not through arrogance, through coherence. Every visual signal they sent was consistent with the expertise they were there to share. The audience gave its attention freely before a single substantive point had landed. And then there were speakers, some of them genuinely impressive in their thinking, who spent the opening minutes of their talk doing something the first group never had to do, earning the room. Not because their ideas were weaker, but because something in their visual presentation had introduced a question the audience was quietly trying to answer. a question about category, about which version of expert this was, about how seriously to weigh up what came next. I watched people with extraordinary expertise work harder than they should have had to, not because they're underqualified, just because their visuals were not speaking the same language as their substance. Now, I want to address something directly because it comes up every time this conversation starts. Authenticity. The word authenticity, whilst I love it, has done considerable damage to professional presentation over the last decade. Not because authenticity is unimportant, but because it's become for many people a reason not to think strategically about visual signals at all. I want to show up as myself. I don't want to change who I am to fit someone else's expectation of what an expert looks like. Now, I understand that instinct completely. But let's consider Steve Jobs. The black Izumiyaki turtleneck, the Levi 501s, the same combination worn to every keynote and every public appearance for years. It's often held up as an example of someone who stripped presentation back, who refused to perform, but that reading misses something important. According to Walter Isaacson's biography, Jobs adopted the uniform for two reasons: the daily convenience of not having to choose an outfit, and more crucially, what Isaacson describes as its ability to convey a signature style. It was not an absence of intentionality. It was the most deliberate possible expression of it. Every element of his appearance was in precise alignment with everything he stood for. Simplicity, focus, the reduction of noise. His presentation was congruent with his product philosophy. That is what authenticity actually means in a professional context. Not self-expression without strategy, but the deliberate alignment between who you are, what you do, who you serve, and every visible signal you send. Authenticity without strategy is not a brand, it's just an outfit. Which brings me back to where I started. For years, my aesthetic had been expressive first and strategic second. And I'm not saying that was wrong, but at the level I was working, the rooms I was moving through, the clients I'm serving, expression for its own sake had started to compete with the authority that I bring into those spaces. My clients are senior leaders, executives, and institutional decision makers. The environments I work in are boardrooms, broadcast studios, and high-stakes professional spaces. I had to ask myself honestly, is every visual signal I am sending congruent with that? Or am I creating distance that my words are quietly having to close? The shift I made, shorter nails, less colour, a more deliberate haircut, less jewellery, a move from expressive to tailored, was not about erasing who I am. It was about ensuring that everything visual about me was working in the same direction. I wanted to be wearing my look, not my look wearing me. For a lot of people in my life, the change has been almost imperceptible, a general sense that something has settled, that I look more like what I am. That's exactly what I'm going for. So here is what I want to leave you with. When someone encounters you, before you have said a word, before they have read your bio or heard your argument or seen your credentials, what do they assume? What story does your visual presence tell? Is it the same story you're telling with your work, your words, and your expertise? Are all the signals pointing in the same direction? Or is there a gap somewhere? And are your words quietly working overtime to close it? Because if the answer to that last question is yes, you're not dealing with a content problem, and you're not dealing with a confidence or visibility problem. You're dealing with a coherence problem. And coherence can be addressed deliberately, strategically, with results that are visible almost immediately in the way rooms receive you. The Media Impact Lab is where that work happens. A rigorous examination of the complete picture you are presenting so that every signal you send is working in service of the authority you've already earned. Because the goal is not to look the part. The goal is to ensure that everything visible about you is telling the truth about your value, and that the room knows exactly how to place you before you've said a single word. This is Recognised. I'm Merisha Stevenson. A full written version of this essay is on my Substack. If it landed for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're ready to close the gap between how you look and how you are received, the Media Impact Lab is where that conversation starts. Until next time, stay credible, stay visible, and most importantly, stay recognised.